Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for another installment of the Spring Seminar Series presentations hosted by the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. My name is David Mirhadi, and I am the chair of the Department of Global Humanities, and I'll be responsible for moderating today's talk. I am pleased to present today's speaker, Dr. Brian Lovelle. Dr. Lovelle is Emeritus Professor in Classical Studies at Loyola University in Chicago, or as he tells me, Loyola on the metro or the.
That's right.
He was also my second year Latin instructor at UBC. So, yeah, where I read the Proarchia for the first time, which turns out to be a very important text for the history of humanities.
You learned that after our class, I think.
Oh, yeah. I think I spent all my time just looking up words in the dictionary.
No, you didn't.
His research interests include archaic Greece, Archilochus, and the 7th century, Greek history and archaeology, tyranny and Athenian democracy, popular consciousness and communication, and myth and history. He's published several articles and 2 books on the subject of Athenian tyranny and, more recently, an introduction to the history and civilization of archaic Greece. He's working to finish a further book on Athenian tyranny, focusing on the period after the death of Peisistratos. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation by Dr. Lovelle.
Thank you, David, very much. I want to thank Heather, especially for setting things up, Wallace for nicely taking instructions, I think, from Heather. David, for having me here. Thank you so much, David. And all of you for being here on a wet Friday afternoon, giving up your Friday afternoon to listen to this. So thank you so much. I've always been interested in sources as a historian, where historians like Herodotus and Thucydides got their information from, assuming that they didn't make it up. Some people say, of course, that Herodotus made everything up, or a lot of it. So that's really my angle today, and why I called this, or the subtitle for this is Excavating the Text, because I want to get down sort of beneath it. I hope you will bear with me with this. I'm not sure that it's particularly exciting. I think this is really old school stuff. You know, my favorite historian up to, I don't know when, was Felix Jacobi. I don't know if you know Felix Jacobi, did the Fragmenta. Kind of a person am I, you know, likes Felix Jacobi. But in any case, I am not adverse to you stopping me too, if there's something that needs repeating or clarification or whatever you would like. Okay, so don't hesitate, but do get my attention by waving, because otherwise I might not see you doing that. Okay, so Thucydides excursus. Oh, before I start, I should say too, do you have a handout or access to the references? No? I do have an extra one if anybody needs an extra printed copy. It can be helpful. As I'm reading. Thucydides' excursus on the Tyrant-Slayers is one of the most famous and controversial passages in his history. In it, he recounts the assassination of Hipparchos, from what motivated the assassins to the aftermath of the deed. He also seeks to destroy the common Athenian belief that Hipparchos was tyrant of Athens when he was killed. These are references 1, 2, and 3. Thucydides argues that Hippias, the brother of Hipparchus, was the eldest son of the old tyrant Peisistratos and ruled Athens at the time of the murder. The assassins, Harmodius and Aristogeiton, were not therefore tyrannicides, since they did not kill a tyrant when they slew Hipparchus. The passage is unusual in Thucydides for its highly dramatic, almost Herodotean character, but also because Thucydides' intensity in arguing against popular Athenian conceptions of the assassination and the tyranny is extreme. When it comes to analysis of the excursus, modern scholars have mainly focused on why it intrudes into Thucydides' extensive narrative on the Sicilian expedition of 415 BCE, and particularly his account of the recall of Alcibiades to Athens from that expedition. Though sent out as one of the three generals for the expedition, Alcibiades was summoned back to Athens to face charges of parodying the Eleusinian mysteries and so committing sacrilege, and of mutilating Athens' herms and so committing sacrilege. According to Thucydides, these acts engendered great fear among the Athenians at home, for they'd been encouraged by Alcibiades' enemies to believe that the mutilation of the herms, especially, was a sign that Alcibiades had been fomenting a revolution. What intensified their fears, and this is number two, was that the Athenians heard that it was not they and Harmodius who had ended the tyranny and so freed Athens a century before, but rather that it was the Spartans and Alcibiades' ancestors, the Alcmaeonid clan, who had done so. What those had done before, Alcibiades, his relatives and adherents might well do again. That is, collaborate with the Spartans, admit them into the city, and so allow the Spartans to win the long conflict we know as the Peloponnesian War. Scholars have long sought to determine the precise lines Thucydides might be drawing between the Tyrant-Slayer episode and the situation at Athens in 415 BCE. My focus today is not on that intrusion or those lines, but rather on the contents of the excursus and Thucydides' sources for them. I think that these need to be set before any progress can be made with the questions involving context. In my subtitle for this presentation, I adopted the metaphor of excavating to describe delving into the text. And as I mentioned, my aim is to dig down with you into the excursus to expose and then evaluate some of its overlooked substrate. My focus will be primarily on two elements: what Thucydides says about Hipparchus' power and status, and what he says about the motivation of Harmodius and Aristogeiton. Both fundamentally affect the content of the narrative, Thucydides' argument about the tyrannicide, and ultimately why Thucydides inserted the excursus where he did. Before proceeding, however, I'd like to set two premises that I hope you won't have too much trouble allowing. First, unless Thucydides made things up about the facts of the incident, he had to have had recourse to pre-existing sources, if only because the events took place long before his own time. In fact, he explicitly admits to such when at 655.1, this would be number 6 on your reference list, he says that he heard that Hippias was the eldest son and so ruled. I assume that he also heard and possibly read other sources on the murder of Hipparchus. Admitting to such sources is significant because the admission qualifies Thucydides' authority on the subject. For facts about the tyrannicide, Thucydides can be no better than the best source he used, oral or written, no matter what logic he brought to bear to reason from the evidence. What could these sources have been? What was available? For his oral sources, some have suggested the Alcmaeonids. For written ones, perhaps somehow the Athis of Hellenicus of Lesbos, although Hellenicus was thought to have transmitted the popular version of the act. Second, whatever those sources, they did not supply Thucydides with any conclusive evidence for what he wanted to prove, since he did not adduce anything factually conclusive in the excursus. That, he says, he knows from oral report or hearsay very well, and firmly asserts that Hippias was tyrant and so ruled. Again, that's reference 6. The assertion does not prove his argument, let alone establish what he says is fact. Thucydides concedes that when he says immediately after his statement about hearsay that someone else could know what he knows from what follows. He then refers to inscriptions on the steliadakias of the tyrants and on the altar from the temple of Apollo Pythias as if they were sound evidence for Hippias' age and status as tyrant. They are, in fact, only two props for his argument about Hippias and primogeniture. He apparently believes strongly, and he wants his readers to believe, that because Hippias was named first after his father on the steliadakias, Hippias' age and primacy were proven. But while the disposition of names on the stele makes Hippias' seniority plausible, It does not prove it, and it certainly does not prove that Hippias was, or that Hipparchus was not, the tyrant at the time of the murder. Male preference primogeniture was not the rule in ancient Greece, and the argument is distinctly forced. Judging from what Thucydides presents in the excursus and briefly at the beginning of his history, we may conclude that the argument is the best that Thucydides can muster to persuade his readers to his conclusions. Arguments are, of course, tendentious by nature, but placing Thucydides' partiality into higher relief are distinct contradictions in the excursus that erode his argumentation. Now, I don't know if we have any friends of Thucydides here, but what I'm saying might amount to fighting words for those who believe in the general soundness of Thucydides' methods and conclusions. You know, I'm stepping on some pretty august sandals after all. But let us remember that Thucydides is well outside of what we might call his historical comfort zone with this subject matter. Indeed, the source material he had to work with, together with the remoteness of the incident, impaired his ability to bring his accustomed, fairly sound methodology to bear. What eye or ear witness could he possibly have tapped into? Thucydides was, as it were, at the mercy of his sources, his reason, and apparently his rather fervent desire to prove his point about the tyrannicide. The belief Thucydides challenges, the popular version of the tyrannicide, was deeply entrenched in Athens when he argued against it. This is indexed by his citation of the Athenians' shock at learning that the truth of it and Athens' liberation in the 6th century BCE was not brought about by them. The popular version finds its earliest expression in the Harmodius Scholia, that's reference number 11, which have been taken as symphonic songs dating from the early 5th century BCE. Their lyrics celebrate Harmodius and Aristogeiton as slayers of the tyrant Hipparchus and liberators of Athens. One apart extols Harmodius alone, and that agrees with Thucydides' mention of him alone in reference number 2 of your handout. A civic cult grew up around the pair, and they had been designated symbols of Athenian democracy for most of the 5th century for what they had done. Statues of them poised in the very act of murder. There they are. Were set up in Athens Agora probably sometime in the 490s, and then a replacement pair no later than 477 BCE. That's the pair that you see here. This is a version from the Museo Nazionale di Napoli. And then this one is from a different place, as you see, the Museo di Gessi, Rome. They're slightly different. And this one is, and this is a version in pottery painting of the act. Harmodius is always shown about ready to deliver the death blow with his arm over his head, ready to come down. Aristogeiton is already thrusting from beneath, always thrusting from beneath. Okay, let's go back to this. Right. These statues were prominent and impressive daily reminders of what most Athenians in Thucydides' day imagined the tyrannicides to have been and to have accomplished. By the later 5th century BCE, it appears that stories reflecting the popular version of Hipparchus' murder will have predominated. In fact, the popular version designating them as Tyrant-Slayers was strong enough to weather Thucydides or any other criticisms and attempts to revise the record. Before getting down to analysis of the passage, let me summarize Thucydides' narrative briefly for you. This is the part that most people, I hope you like it too. Hipparchus became enamored of Harmodius, a handsome young Athenian, quote, in the flower of youthful beauty, unquote, and made a pass at him. The boy rejected Hipparchus' advance and immediately told his lover Aristogeiton about it. This is number 4. Aristogeiton, who is described by Thucydides as a man of the city, a middling sort of citizen, and so not an Aristos, was very stricken erotically. He was afraid that Hipparchus would use his dynamis, his power, to induce Harmodius forcibly, Bia, to come over to him. The words dynamis and Bia with force are noteworthy. Aristogeiton was thus emotionally triggered and began plotting straight away from his existing circumstances the destruction of the tyranny. These last words, destruction of the tyranny, are also significant. When Hipparchus propositioned Harmodius yet again and was again rejected, the son of Peisistratos sought revenge. Hipparchus wanted to get back at Harmodius, literally, this is number 5, to bespatter him with mud, but he also wanted to use no force. Rather, he wanted the spattering to occur in an unobvious way, as though it was not on account of the refusal. This was because, quoting Thucydides, he, and the antecedent to the pronoun of the verbs ein and katastesata must be Hipparchus. He was not otherwise oppressive to the mass of people regarding his power, but rather managed it without reproach. And these tyrants cultivated virtue and good judgment to the greatest extent. Of course, this is a stunning contradiction to what Thucydides is arguing as it stands, and I'll return to that later on. You'll notice that how Hipparchus' planned retribution appears to be exceptional. It disrupts an apparently previously unblemished record of virtue and good judgment for the Peisistratos, a record of which Hipparchus is notably very conscious. Although the insult must be somehow muted, and he can't deliver it overtly, or so he wants to do. And yet, as Dover has pointed out in his commentary on Thucydides, to be effective, insult depends on its publicity. And so here we have a paradox: how to deliver an insult without the insult being delivered. But then Hipparchus does an about-face. For all of his goodness and perceived need for furtiveness, the insult will be delivered in a very public fashion in a form that is most associated with the outrages perpetrated by the worst tyrants known to the ancient Greeks. Thucydides is very clear that Hipparchus achieved his aim of vengeance, and that Harmodius and Aristogeiton were also quite clear about exactly who had delivered the insult. Those are references 7 and then 9. A further item of note here is that Thucydides' reports on Hipparchus' thoughts and intention occur as they are unfolding. How were his thoughts preserved and transmitted to Thucydides? This is a recurring feature of the excursus, whereby Thucydides describes the very thoughts of the principles as they are happening. I presume that these are to be attributed to his sources rather than to Thucydides. In the midst of the tyrannicide narrative, Thucydides inserts his lengthy and vigorous argument for the seniority and so the primacy of Hippias. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but he ends the chapter by emphasizing that Hipparchus was reckoned tyrant because he happened to be killed and because he was the tyrant in fact, not because he was the tyrant in fact, and then he resumes the narrative. Harmodius' maiden sister was summoned to carry a basket in a Pan-Athenaic procession, a very great honor. But after she had come forward, the girl was literally driven off, with those who summoned her driving her off, saying that she hadn't been invited in the first place because she was unworthy. In a paper I wrote long ago, I argued that the Greek words me axia, not worthy, unworthy, designated the girl as non-virginal. This is positively the worst charge that could be applied to an unmarried maiden in ancient Greece. On further reflection, it has occurred to me that the rejection might have been taken to imply that it was Hipparchus who claimed carnal knowledge of the girl and informed the Pan-Athenaic committee of that. I make a bit light here. I don't know if there was such a committee, but the number of the verbs and the participles is plural. In any event, the girl's reputation, as well as her community standing, her brothers and her families, were ruined. The burden of mortification fell most heavily, believe it or not, upon Harmodius, who, as her brother, was held most responsible by the community for her misconduct. Hipparchus had contrived the most malign and pernicious way of getting back at the boy, and so had wreaked the most terrible vengeance. Harmodius, quite reasonably, took the public rejection of his sister very badly indeed. Greek social convention required him to strike back violently to redeem the honor of his family, his sister, and his own. Now, fully committed to ending the tyranny, though not explicitly killing Hipparchus, Harmodius and Aristogeiton recruited a few Confederates, hoping that when other Athenians saw them attacking, they would join to free Athens. And that is number 5. The word is sun eleutheroun, joined together to free. This is the second time that Thucydides mentions that the would-be assassins, though personally affronted by Hipparchus, aimed to destroy the tyranny and free Athens. On the day of the assassination, they targeted Hippias, Thucydides said, who was just outside the walls of Athens marshaling the Panathenaic procession. That, by the way, contradicts Thucydides himself, who states, this is number one, that Hipparchus was marshaling the Panathenaic procession. Who's marshaling the Panathenaic procession? When Harmodius and Aristogeiton saw one of their confederates talking familiarly with Hippias, they reckoned, and nomison, they'd been betrayed and were within an ace of being arrested. So, and this is 9 and 11, they wanted, if they were able, a boulanto, a dunanto, before they were taken, to avenge themselves on him who had caused them grief and on whose account they had risked everything. That is, of course, Hipparchus. They rushed inside the cities, happened upon Hipparchus near the Laocoreon in the Agora, and killed him with their short swords. Maybe this one's better. Oops. Oh, by the way, just wanted to show you this. Sorry, go back one here. Just some fanciful, oh golly, making a muck of this. This is some fanciful later golly, artwork. You see French in French. That shows Hipparchus sending off the shamed sister of Harmodius. And this is them, Harmodius and Aristogeiton in German, and it's German artist, seeing one of their confederates talking with, well, he's actually talking with Hippias. I mean, that's actually what the caption was. Anyway, let's go back to this. It's got more action. Okay. Thus, the pair wound up killing him who had wronged them, and only after adopting Plan B, and apparently by happenstance. The historian says quite explicitly that Aristogeiton was motivated to kill from erotic madness, Harmodius from being outraged. Thus, the assassination of Hipparchus occurred, as Thucydides says, at the very beginning of the excursus because of erotic circumstance. I hope you have seen that there are problems with this right off the bat. But let's focus on Thucydides' statement about Hipparchus' power and status. Item 1, most apparent and contradictory of Thucydides' assertion is that number 5, for he, Hipparchus, was not otherwise oppressive to the mass of the people in regard to his power, but rather managed it without reproach. To quote Kenneth Dover on this passage, as the text stands, if the subject of Ain and Katastesata is Hipparchus, Thucydides, when he wrote these words, does not appear to have held the belief for which he has just argued and will argue again. To salvage Thucydides, Dover admits that there is, quote, really no plausible alternative to emendation of the text. Change the text, make it say what you want. That is, then, to change the referent to Hippias somehow, or to make the verbs plural in number instead of singular, and not have the referent, again, be Hipparchus. But there's no textual authority anywhere, absolutely, to amend. The problem can't be so easily dismissed. To this, we might add 2 other less forceful allusions to Hipparchus' power in Thucydides, that influence over who does and does not carry a basket in the Panathenaic procession, and his marshalling of the Panathenaic procession in Book 1. Thucydides sees fit to reassign the duty of marshalling to Hippias in Book 6, indicating the connection of its oversight to tyrannical power, at least in his mind. Item 2, Aristogeiton fears that Hipparchus would employ his dynamis to prevail over Harmodius, and that he would bring Harmodius to himself by force. The meaning of dynamis is clear enough, but forcing subjects for purposes of sexual gratification is a heinous crime in ancient Greece, and is especially associated with the worst behavior of tyrants. Herodotus, and this is number 15, uses beatai to specify and condemn the routine sexual abuse of women by Greek tyrants. Aristotle in the Politics says that tyrants should not outrage Brisdonta, maidens and youths. Harmodius kills because of being outraged. This is number 9, Hubrismenos. Item 3, in Thucydides, Hipparchus wants not to force Harmodius, but neither can he back away from the incident. Rather, he plots to serve revenge in an unobvious way. Hipparchus is angry because he was turned down, but does not let his emotions consume him, in contrast to Aristogeiton. Rather, Hipparchus considers that he must cloak his retribution out of consideration for the regime's better interests and calculates its timing. Such conspicuous sobriety, restraint, forethought, and calculation fit nicely with the following sentence in Thucydides about the general comportment of the tyrants and the goodness and intelligence of their regime. But they also fit together with a version of the popular tradition found in the Pseudo-Platonic dialogue Hipparchus. In it, Hipparchus is portrayed as the tyrant, but also as, quote, the oldest and wisest of Peisistratos' sons who provided many proofs of wisdom, unquote, a philosopher ruler, in fact. We might simply dismiss the dialogue as late, fanciful, and untrustworthy, except for its partial agreement with Thucydides' account. But there is a stronger, indisputable proof of at least Hipparchus' own claim to sageness in the herms that bear his name. According to the dialogue, this is 12, the Hipparchian herms were set up throughout Attica and were inscribed with Delphic maxims, words to live by, introduced by Hipparchus. This herm portion that you see here, this is the Coropi herm. And again, this is in your reference. This has an inscription on it. You can just see the letters that match almost exactly what's said in the Pseudo-Platonic dialogue Hipparchus. So this is proof positive that Hipparchus aspired to be considered thoughtful and wise. And he does not do this in tandem with his brother Hippias or the regime, but he does this all alone, according to the dialogue, the lead-in, which doesn't survive here, doesn't remain, is that Hipparchus says, all by himself. It's a very strange thing for Hippias to permit if he were the ruling tyrant. Taken together with Thucydides' statements about Hipparchus' restraint and the regime's character, the herms suggest that Hipparchus contributed appreciably to the tyranny's reputation for goodness and intelligence. Item 4, for all of Hipparchus' philosophical sobriety and restraint, and despite what Thucydides says about the goodness and intelligence of the regime, Hipparchus nevertheless delivers a devastating insult of a kind that hallmarks the worst behavior of evil tyrants. In doing so, he displays one of the classic signs of wicked tyranny, namely hubris. Hubris is exactly the ingredient in unrighteous Greek rulers that impels them to shatter the boundaries of acceptable social behavior and perpetrate crime, including forcing unwilling subjects to indulge them sexually. As we have seen, Harmodius was outraged by the insult to his sister. So in contrast to Thucydides' description of Hipparchus as measured and restrained, he acts in this case, in the textbook way of the evil tyrant. He's the really good tyrant, and now he's the really bad tyrant, almost simultaneously. And he does this by impugning the chastity of the innocent girl and ruining her forever. She has no future. Note the dissonance between the general record of the tyranny and Hipparchus and what seems to be a one-off occurrence. Nonetheless, insofar as it is tyrants, albeit the worst ones, who do such things, this is another allusion to Hipparchus' status as tyrant. And finally, item 5, various testimonia from other sources agree with the indications of Hipparchus' tyrannical power found in Thucydides. Among the more credible ones, Herodotus mentions that the cosmologist Onomakritos was exiled from Athens by Hipparchus because Onomakritos had tampered with the Peisistratos oracle collection. That's a very bad thing to do. Maybe talk about that later. It is thus implied that Hipparchus had the custodianship of that important, perhaps vital collection of oracles, and that he had also had the authority to send Onomakritos out of Athens. In Aelian and the dialogue Hipparchus, we read that Hipparchus not Hippias, sent a pentaconter to take Anacreon safely off the island of Samos and convey him to Athens. And by the way, these are both a reference 10. Of course, the author of the Hipparchus adopts the popular view of Hipparchus' power, stating outright that this guy was the tyrant. He also rejects the centerpiece of Thucydides' story, the insult to Harmodius' sister, as the reason for the murder. Well, before pulling any conclusions from this, let's move on to the motivations of Harmodius and Aristogeiton. The historian summarizes both succinctly at the time of the murder, number 9. Aristogeiton acted on account of erotic anger, whereas Harmodius was motivated by being outraged, obviously due to the insult. Thucydides thus specifies 2 distinct motivations, and that is significant. First, before looking at the pair individually, another contradiction is to be noted. Although Thucydides loads Harmodius and Aristogeiton with private animus, in his account, they plot against the tyranny and to free Athens, exactly how the popular tradition saw them aimed. Thucydides, trying to draw together private and political motivations, helps to account for the glaring unevenness of Aristogeiton's emotions and actions in the excursus, as we'll see, I hope. Orge, the word that Thucydides uses to summarize Aristogeiton's motivation, is, to quote one scholar, descriptive of an emotion that, quote, usually leads to rash, heedless, and excessive action, unquote. It is, in fact, the bookend of Aristogeiton's motivation after he'd learned that Harmodius had been propositioned. This is number 4. There, he is very stricken erotically and in fear of the power of Hipparchus. Thucydides uses the word perialgesas only once elsewhere in his entire work, where he describes the horrified reaction of the Spartans when they realized that their men on Sphacteria were now completely cut off by the Athenian fleet. Translations of what affects the Spartans here have included maddened, beside themselves with grief, and greatly pained. But their actions say more about the definition of this word or what it prompts. They do not stand down at all, but rather are activated by their emotions to throw themselves into a renewed fight. They rush headlong into the water of Navarino Bay to retrieve the ships the Athenians were dragging away, heedless of the consequences. Thucydides' usage here implies a sudden surge of emotion that results in precipitous action. Yet for all of Aristogeiton's erotikos perialgesas and phobetes, he does not act, but instead plots to bring down the entire tyranny. We hear nothing more of the conspiracy until the insult to Harmodius' sister, but then, though Aristogeiton is, quote, keener, now much more because of Harmodius, he still holds back again to renew his plotting. In Thucydides' account, Aristogeiton is by turns wildly emotional, but then goes quietly about organizing a conspiracy that only materializes after Harmodius sends his sister blithely off to the tender mercies of the wronged Hipparchus. Yet for all of this plotting, the conspiracy has only a few confederates for safety's sake. In fact, the only co-conspirator of which we hear is the apparent turncoat who is seen talking familiarly to Hippias outside Athens' walls. I find Aristogeiton's off again, on again emotions to be difficult to believe, especially because I think Thucydides has tried to tie in passion with plotting. You may not agree. However, there are related issues that should throw things into some doubt for you. Aristogeiton's mood swings tie in with the question of source. How were these swings recorded in the first place and then transmitted down to Thucydides? Aristogeiton had offspring, but how would they have known to gauge his emotional state or track his erratic behavior this way before the assassination? How would Thucydides have learned of it? As far as I can tell, diaries were not kept by the ancient Greeks. Can you imagine? Dear diary, today I'm going to kill Hipparchus. Next day, dear diary, today I've decided instead to start a conspiracy. I make light, but the same questions may be asked about the thoughts of Harmodius and Aristogeiton, especially after they're turned away from Hippias. Thucydides says, when they saw one of their confederates talking familiarly with Hippias, they feared and reckoned they'd been betrayed and were on the point of being apprehended. So upon him who had aggrieved them and on whose account they'd risk everything, they resolved, if they could, to wreak vengeance. These sentences purport to be the very thoughts of the tyrannicides on the instant before they act, and Harmodius died. Another footnote here, the resolution of the pair to do something before they are taken is strongly reminiscent of Hector's last words to himself before he launches forlornly against Achilles. He wants to do something big that future generations will learn of before he dies at the hands of Achilles. It is very difficult to deem these personal thoughts to be other than inventions and added to increase the color of the murder episode. As for Harmodius' motivation, in Thucydides, Harmodius makes no move to act until the insult to his sister, except for being solicited by Hipparchus twice at the outset of the story and reporting it to Aristogeiton. Harmodius is invisible. There is no reaction to Aristogeiton's emotional turmoil, no sense that he's involved in Aristogeiton's plotting. He's oblivious to the possibility of retribution on the part of Hipparchus, even after Harmodius rejected his advances a second time. Rather, he sent his sister off to the tyrant-dominated festival board, ostensibly suspecting nothing. It's important to note that both assassins and their confederates are activated only at the time of the Panathenaic festival. Well, to answer all this, I believe, is simply to follow Thucydides' lead and to accept that there are at least two motives in the excursus. Aristogeiton is motivated by passion for Harmodius, Harmodius because of the insult to his sister. Two motives imply two versions of the tyrannicide story, and the author of the Hipparchus dialogue affirms that. That's number 13. The insult is the most popular version, and he rejects it as silly. The other involves the rivalry of Hipparchus and Aristogeiton and an unnamed boy, though the latter is the Aramenos of Harmodius. In this variant version, the boy took up with Hipparchus and then haughtily rejected Harmodius and Aristogeiton. They are then moved to kill Hipparchus. Thucydides, I assume, has tried to blend the versions featuring the separate motivations of Aristogeiton and Harmodius together and hasn't made a particularly good job of it. According to the dialogue author, the most popular version of the tyrannicide's motivation was the insult story. It unfolds much nearer in time to the actual assassination. It certainly does provide a much clearer cause and effect sequencing than that does not detach the motive from the murder. In popularity and position in Thucydides, its popularity and position in Thucydides imply that the insult story was in fact the popular one in Athens, the one, quote, most Athenians believed, unquote, when Thucydides composed the excursus, even as the author of the Hipparchus applies. As with the motivation, so with Hipparchus' power, the conclusion to be drawn from this seems to be forced. Elements of the popular versions of the tyrannicide are present in Thucydides' excursus. The popular version designated Hipparchus a tyrant. Thucydides tried to incorporate both popular accounts circulating in his day, seeking to reinterpret them to fit his preconceptions about who was and who was not tyrant at the time of Hipparchus' death. The hallmarks of this remarkably unsuccessful blending are the contradictions about Hipparchus' power and the dissonance between the two motives of the tyrannicides. I can't give a conclusive reason for why this great historian, this icon of ancient historian, is so sloppy here, but I also can't ignore what's present in the excursus. It's possible that Thucydides meant to come back to it and write the contradiction. In any case, it seems clear from the fact that Thucydides used the popular versions, tried to reason from them in unrelated documents, like the inscriptions, because he had nothing else. There was nothing else to use, and so he used what he had. While he adduces nothing that is conclusive about Hipparchus' status as tyrant, he is right that Athens was not liberated by Harmodius and Aristogeiton. The 4-year gap between the murder and Hippias' expulsion is the most likely ground for his adamancy about who was tyrant at the time of Hipparchus' murder, and so his belief that the tyrannicide was a sham.
The details.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
If people want to be asking questions online, is there actually anyone online? There may be, yeah. They should type in questions in the Q&A box, I think, yeah. In the meantime, are there questions?
So, thank you so much for this. Before I ask the question, I just want to get the basics right because it hinges on this. You said that the excursus appears around the Sicilian expedition and in relation or close to Alcibiades being pursued and recalled, right?
Right.
Okay, so, is there any chance that this connection of a prudent, misunderstood tyrant who was actually good for the city, whatever his moral composition,
Mhm.
might be a way of thinking about Alcibiades in the very same way and criticizing the Athenians for showing orgy
Mhm.
in reacting to Alcibiades in the same way that there is a certain critique of being shallow and just focusing on your orgy and your own personal interest and insults with Aristogiton and Harmodius.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really nice way of interpreting it. I think the problem for me is that it contradicts other things that Thucydides says about Alcibiades, beginning with his deception of the Athenians after the arrival of a Spartan embassy that wanted to conclude peace through the agency of Nicias. Nicias had arranged for the Spartans to come and propose peace to the Athenians. Alcibiades, seeing a chance to derail a political opponent, decided that he would intervene. He happened to be a guest friend of the Spartans. And so he told them that they should not talk to the boule, but they should talk to the assembly instead, because the boule would shut them down immediately. And he knew that, in fact, by doing that, the Spartans would go on into the assembly. And there, the duplicitous fellow accused the Spartans of saying one thing and doing another before the assembly, and he had them howled out of Athens. It's clear from what Thucydides says that he did this not looking to the best interests of the city. He did it because he was ambitious and that he saw a chance of torpedoing Nicias, who was at that time the most powerful of politicians. So that's one thing. And then there are other things that Thucydides says about Alcibiades. For example, that he caused the Athenians to want to go on this mad expedition to Sicily. It was his lies that inflated the possibilities that the Athenians grasped only so willingly, that caused them to invest in this debacle. So while there is that ability to see Hipparchos as Alcibiades or Alcibiades as Hipparchos, and for the Athenians to get some lessons from that, seems to me you have to account for these other negative things that come out in Thucydides about Alcibiades. Could happen, I mean, you did this bad thing, you did this bad thing, but he doesn't deserve to have, this bad thing. Look at what happened to someone who was not so bad, and that was against Athens' best interests.
Yeah, I mean, I completely buy what you say on the general manner of moral assessment of Alcibiades. I was just curious about the degree to which Thucydides might ultimately be the ultimate Thucydidean in that realpolitik maybe reigns in this case, irrespective of the morality.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and certainly later on, there's a sort of a change of tune, even in Alcibiades. In Thucydides about Alcibiades, because Alcibiades turns out to be the best chance that the Athenians had for saving their skins, and they turned against him. So yeah, this could mark that change, perhaps, from the Alcibiades of before this disapproved to the Alcibiades, maybe not approved of, but thought of as being the the answer for survival.
Which would also considerably speak of an evolving Thucydidean gaze on Alcibiades throughout his work, and the work being a work in progress. in a
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
And you hinted to the fact that this is conceivable. that
It's very
he never fixed inconsistencies.
Absolutely. It's very conceivable. It could be a work in I mean, it seems to stop pretty abruptly, where it stops in 8. So book 8. Oh, it's very possible.
Other questions? Anything online? Okay.
That piece of pottery,
Mm.
where was it found? Is this found in Athens, or is this, or did the story travel in general?
Yeah. I wish I could answer. I don't know the provenance for it.
Yeah.
I'm assuming it could have been found in Tuscany. I don't know. I'd have to check on that. But I mean, is there a significance you're seeing, or?
No, I'm just.
Just interested.
I'm just interested in the afterlife
Yeah.
of tyrannicide,
Yeah.
as something that others other than the Athenians engage with.
Yeah.
I mean, I can see how Romans can engage with this in
Yeah.
their own traditions, but.
Yeah. Now for a footnote to that. Is that okay?
Mhm.
I don't want to keep you guys any longer than necessary here. It is said that the statues that Alexander sent back, there were 2 groups of tyrannicide statues, one by Antenor and one by Critias and Nesiotes, and that would be this pair here is the Critias and Nesiotes, the latest one, 477 BC, and before that is the Antenor one. When the statues of the original tyrannicides were sent back from Susa to Athens, they stopped on their way at Rhodes. And there they were honored so much that instead of being set up or put into a warehouse, they were actually laid down on couches. This has caused some art historians to consider that these might have been kuroi, because it'd be very hard to lay something like that down on a couch. But what it shows is the reverence of the Rhodians, who were no friends of the Athenians in the late 4th century, for the characters. So great had the publicity come about these 2 being symbols, freedom, of liberation from the idea of tyranny, that the Rhodians gave them respect by laying them on couches. I don't know if they tried to feed them, but made them feel at home, I suppose.
Rhodes, in his commentary, it talks about there even being a woman involved in some of the traditions.
Yeah.
Who ends up what? Do they end up cutting her tongue out or something?
Yeah.
And it just seemed to me that it's the sort of story that attracts apocryphal accretions a
Yeah.
great deal. And
Yeah.
at some point, everybody kind of has the responsibility to say, okay, up to this point, it's true, and the rest is apocryphal.
Yes.
But where you choose to do that, and
I think the only criterion that I, as a historian, would use would be age. That the older it is, the more claim it has to authority than the newer. So what we have is Thucydides as a terminus antiquem for these 2 motives, right? Somehow they had to be spawned or generated before Thucydides wrote, composed. And from there, it's anybody's guess when they were, invented. I think they're both invented. I think nobody knew why Harmodius and Aristogeiton did what they did, and these things were made up for the fact. That's my own view, though. So it's very difficult because before Thucydides, there's nothing.
Right, so you're saying that the accounts in the Ath Hall are later a part of the Grecian.
I would say, I thought that's what you were saying.
Yeah, well, it just seemed to me that, especially with the statues being set up, the scholia of the tyrannicide songs and so on,
Mhm.
that there seems just in that period,
Mhm.
500 to
Mhm.
470 or
Mhm.
so,
Mhm.
a very fertile time
Yeah.
for
No,
lots of versions of the stories to come out. And that's well before Thucydides, so.
but right, but those are phantoms that we have only, for example, this Harmodius Scholia and the statues to attest. There are no versions that come out of that in the 5th century. But if you look at the statues, I mean, what do you see? If we take those to be faithful reproductions of the originals, I mean, obviously these are Roman copies. You see an older man and a younger man. Okay? And in Thucydides, he's a youthful, he's in the bloom of youth or something like this, Harmodius. He's probably in his teens, right? That as he's depicted here. But there is testimony to the effect that the descendants of Harmodius and Aristogeiton were to be given public favor by the Athenians. How does a teenager have descendants? Even from this point then, there is a dissonance between the fact and the, what do I call it, the expression of the fact. I'm not sure, it could be that they're both the same age when they do this, but that this idea of the older and younger man developed. Then we have the Aristogeiton love story, because it fits. If you have older and younger like that, it fits. But then it spawned from the way the statues are portrayed rather than fact. You say to yourself, well, why are they portrayed that way? I mean, that's not that far in time from the actual. These guys were unknowns at the time. Nobody knew who they were. They were killed. If any statues were erected, some say that the statues were erected immediately after the death of, or after the expulsion of Hipparchos, 4 years after the death. Who can remember what they looked like then? Even then, if you say that's the earliest point, I don't think that you have statues of Antenor until the 490s. That's 20 years after. So I think they're fanciful. But that's, I can't prove it.
I guess between the Herm, the Hipparchos Herms, which I think you said that they're in Coropy or something like that. So they're far out. They're not in the city. They're in Mesogia. And the urban kind of statue. You have attention, memory, and commemoration. You have different segments in the Athenian constituency that would flock to one or flock to the other. And between those two, even physical spaces, you have stories that can also be conflicting. And circulating.
But as in myth, it's what people in numbers choose to believe that have that particular myth triumph. And according to the information we have, it's the insult story that seems to have the most favor. By the way, these terms, this is one of 152 that were erected between the pseudo-Hipparchos says, pseudo-Platonic Hipparchos says that these were erected midway between city and each deme. That's a lot of advertisement for one guy, right? There's another problem with demes because, until Cleisthenes makes his deme system, we don't know how they arrive, between a deme and a city. This is an archaic, it's clearly archaic lettering. It's not more modern than archaic, so,
The deems exist before Pleistocene.
yeah.
They're just, the tribal system doesn't exist.
Well, to the number, I guess I'm wrong in saying 152. Because that's the number of Pleistocene deems. So the number of deems could be more or less depending upon what they were thought of in Hipparchus' day. 20 years before, well, 10 years before Pleistocene, or more.
We have no evidence archaeologically that it was an effort of Damnatio Memoria on these terms. They were found mostly there, and do we know anything?
This is it.
That's it, that's just.
That's it.
Yeah.
And this was the last report on it was part of a fire ring that somebody had at their house. Before that, I think it was a member, it had been used as a member in a church out in the Cafelli, I think, in that area. Yeah, that's the theme. So they were probably reused rather than there being a damnatio memoriae. In Herodotus, there's some pretty fond memories of Hipparchus. You know, and the night before he dies, he has a dream that he's, you know, the young man kills him or something, and he goes to a dream interpreter. The dream interpreter says, "Don't worry, Lion. Everything will be fine." Lion is particularly associated with royalty in Herodotus and elsewhere. So there's a certain fondness there for him, positivity, let's call it, instead of fondness. And it could go hand in hand with this reputation of him being pretty even temp, pretty good guy. You know, not bad, not having any of these blips of evilness that pop up in Thucydides. You know, some people call the age of Peisistratos the golden age, the age of Chronos. And I think it bled into the younger tyrants as well. Anyway, I want to thank you very much for that. I mean, I don't want to call an end to questions by any means.
We'll have a chance to go over for pizza and potables,
Ooh.
as I say. But before we leave, I want to let you know about our next presentation, which will take place on the Ides of March, Friday, March 15th at 2:30 with a panel discussion. I guess the chair of the department should show up. It could be a bad idea. Ancient past for modern audiences, a critical approach to pedagogy and the digital humanities and ancient Mediterranean studies. Am I right that Sabrina has something to do with it?
Yes.
And then a week after that, although on Thursday, March 21st, the 8th annual McWhinney Memorial Lecture is happening, featuring Emeritus speaker Thucydides, entitled "Liberalism and the Foundation of the Modern Greek State from 1830 to 1880." To learn more about the speakers for this semester and this year's McWhinney Lecture, go to our newly refreshed website, sfu.ca/Hellenic Studies/newsroom. I think if you just put in Hellenic Studies, you'll find the newsroom there. Thanks for attending, and look forward to seeing you, many of you, next week.